Aaron Berkowitz back here with the Jewish Literary Journal, and Roslyn Bernstein, who is the author of several books, including Boardwalk Stories, Engaging Art, and her most recent work, The Girl Who Counted Numbers. Since the 1980s, she has been reporting from around the globe and is Professor Emerita in the Department of Journalism and Writing Professions at Baruch College of the City University of New York. Welcome, Roslyn. Thanks for being here with us today.
You're welcome. I'm glad to be here. Glad to be here.
Perfect. So the first question is, why this book and why now?
Well, those two questions go together. They're very smartly put together, because I traveled to Israel. I've been to Israel a dozen times, but I first traveled to Israel in 1961. I was on a fellowship from Brandeis University, the Hyatt Fellowship. And that was the year of the Adolf Eichmann trial. Okay. We arrived actually just at the end of the trial, but I call it the year of the Eichmann trial because the people were consumed by it. This was a year, you have to remember that at that time, there really was very little television, closed circuit, but very little television. And so most people listened to the testimony from the trial on radios or on loudspeakers that blasted it, literally blasted it sometimes in the street. And so throughout the day and the evening or whatever, you would hear testimonies of survivors. Unlike the Nuremberg trial, which was in the 50s, that was largely officials, party officials. This was really the people, and survivors listened, and people you couldn't get into the hall, so they would gather in various places where they could listen together. And it was a very tense time. Now, why this book? Well, first of all, I lived there then. Okay, I was there, and I was intensely aware of a couple things. Not only the trial, I had read about the trial, but also about a great gap that existed in society. 1961, the survivors were just beginning to talk about things. They had swallowed a lot of what they experienced and only shared it with their immediate family. So that was the first thing. Also, in that year, there were the beginning of Moroccan Jews were coming, Tunisian Jews were coming. So you had a very mixed population, not sharing the same experiences. You had people who knew what it was like to be in Auschwitz or Machnow or Dachau, but there were people who had their own troubles, like the Moroccans who had lost businesses and who had prejudice, but who had not been who had not been in camps. And so I was aware of the fact that it was almost like a little bit of a caste system. What did the Moroccans, Tunisians, what did they do? They worked building concrete buildings. What did the women do? They cleaned the toilets, they cleaned the homes. They lived in very poor accommodations. And all of this time, they were listening to the trial too. So there was a split in society, and there was a lot of pain. Now, I thought about this, and here I am, a person. I've written hundreds and hundreds. Actually, I've written 4 books. You left out 1 book. I wrote a book on Soho, the history of Soho. But somehow, it was such a big thing. It had been so mesmerizing and transforming in my life. I was young, that I couldn't sit down and write about it. Now, when I arrived in Israel, I knew some Hebrew, knew a lot of Hebrew. And so I used to sit in the cafes and listen to the survivors talking, whispering to one another, telling their secrets. And I understood them because my Hebrew is good. And so over the years, I kept thinking, somebody has to write a book, not about what it was like to be in the camps, not about 1939 and 40 and 41 and 42 through 45, not about those years, but about later, about what they were left with and how they dealt with Eichmann. And so that was, I said, I'll have to write a book about 1961, but you know what happened? It was too painful. It was like almost my secret. And I kept thinking I was going to write it. And I wrote many, many stories on Israel, Israeli art, all kinds of stories, but I never did that for 61 years. And one day I won a fellowship to the Virginia Center for Creative Arts. It's a writing workshop. And on that first day that I was there, I opened up my computer and I wrote the first 2 chapters of this book. It's as if I finally had let go of all the secrets I had heard, and I was willing to tell them, to let people know them. So why this book? This book burned a hole in my heart. And why now? Because it took me all this time. And the other thing was that I knew that it couldn't be nonfiction. I've written many nonfiction books, but I didn't want to write a nonfiction book. I wanted to write a novel. I wanted to write a novel where the people could express themselves. Sometimes, the truth is that you get more truth in fiction than you do in nonfiction. So that's why I did it this way.
It's interesting how many sort of parts to the story. Something that you mentioned that I was thinking about is the idea of radio as sort of the host for the trial versus perhaps television. Do you think that there was a difference in how people approach the trial because it was auditory rather than perhaps visual as well?
It's a really great question. Don't forget, in America, there was television, but in Israel, there really wasn't. Very, very little. I think you're right. I think that's a very sharp question. Because when people spoke, when the announcers spoke, they were very passionate. And you know what? People would yell back at them. It was as if there was a conversation going on. Someone would say, today at the trial, a woman talked about the fact that 6 members of her family were murdered. And when I've heard some of these said, and then when that was finished, when the woman finished saying that, 3 people in the audience started screaming. 6 people murdered, 6 people, that's nothing. 12 people were murdered in my family. Another person said, my whole family was murdered. So the auditory, yes, it was different because television, you couldn't have that. This was a real conversation. This was really anger that could be expressed, and people screamed and yelled. And in some of the testimony that I've read, people were screaming, you bastard, you bastard, you bastard, to Eichmann. Of course, he was in the glass booth and he wasn't heard it, but the other people in the room heard it. So auditory was a big factor.
Do you think that the auditory nature sort of, what is it about the anger and the auditory nature of sort of call and response perhaps here allowed either not reconciliation, but sort of, do you think it helped people heal?
These people, it took a long time to heal. And I would even say heal ? Because some of them, eventually, I think a lot of them healed when they let all the secrets out. There were secrets. There were how the survivors had to survive. How did they survive? Wasn't so easy. Sometimes they did things that they felt guilty about doing. And my book is all about secrets. If you've read the book, you know that there were survivors. There was a woman whose lover was a Nazi. The irony of her story and what killed her and what aggravated her until she finally got it out was that initially she had done it to save her life. He raped her. That's what happened. She wanted to save her life because she was the last woman left in her bunk, in the bunk, and she was next. But somehow, and she whispered this in a secret, and we learned that there were times she loved him. So, and similarly with the uncle who's missing, Yaakov. He didn't go to America when the family went to America. We never, the young girl is sent there to find out why. And the why is a big secret. And I held that why till chapter 7. I held it to the end of the book so that readers would know. I would say that the auditory allowed anger to come out. Yes. Not all the anger, but a lot of it,
It's interesting you're sort of framing your book in secrets. I was thinking more around searching as sort of a major theme. So it's interesting, sort of, they seem almost in conflict.
Well, they're not in conflict if you think about it, because you search to find out if there are secrets. Okay. When you search, you want to find out what you don't know. And what you don't know could be a secret. So, yes, the book is definitely about searching. There's no doubt about it. That's the thematic about it, searching. And she goes from place to place. And one of the things that was really helpful to me is, I've been a journalist and I've been in Israel a lot. And maybe you have too, I don't know your background. But so there's an authenticity. It's a novel, but there's an authenticity to the book. There are streets that I walked. There are places that I went. I've always gone through the library at Yad Vashem. I've gone to some of these Marxist kibbutzim. So I was able in the book, even though it was a novel, I didn't have a real Uncle Yaakov, et cetera, et cetera. I was able to give it authenticity. There are some little things, though, which I confess to you, I used because they came from my background. For example, I took the shtetl of Rosvedov as the shtetl. Why? That's where my family comes from. Okay. I took the year of 1920 because that's when my family left. But there was no older brother left there. I mean, that's all the novel. I tried it. When you're a journalist, you have the compulsion to be truth-telling. So I tried to make this a very truth-telling novel, a novel that revealed, in the search, it revealed secrets. I mean, we find out about Ruth. We find out why Yaakov didn't go with his family. And yet we get some reconciliation in the book. The book does not end in despair, okay? The book ends with Eichmann's trial over. Eichmann, as you know, was cremated and ashes thrown in the, they didn't want a shrine to him. So they didn't want anybody to come and visit him. So that was Eichmann. And the survivors seemed freer to talk about things. There seemed to be some, that they had gotten out some of this, the pain had been released. So I would say that a lot of pain was released in that year.
Yeah, something that came up in terms of truth and fiction. I think another major theme in the book was a balancing of real versus imagined and now versus memory. It's interesting you're talking, it took 61 years to write the book. So there is a component there of what might be real versus what's sort of a figment of imagination, or what memory actually is? Is it real? Is it something else? How does trauma affect it?
Gosh. Well, I have a very good memory. So, or at least I'd had a very good memory. And I've been to Israel many times since, so that all these places that I've seen a million times. Well, not a million times, but a dozen times at least. I did live in Rehavia, that neighborhood of Rehavia. I know that neighborhood well. But I think it took me this long because I needed to really work out the plot of this book. I think the plot, I did not want this to be the following. There are many excellent books, and I've read them, about first-person stories of people who lived through the Holocaust. Many excellent books about the Holocaust, history books. I mean, I'm pretty well read on that. But I didn't want my book to be that. I wanted my book to be something else. I wanted my book to be not a sad tale of wet Owen, but a sort of more realistic tale of how people lived through it. And I think, I'd like to hope I accomplished that.
I think
it took me a long time to get the right. I kept changing it till I got it right.
I do think there is an interesting now emphasis on after the Holocaust, right? But I do think it is interesting, right? It did take. I think it's interesting that in 1961 is when people sort of felt free, in a way, right? That took 20 years almost, and then again now, as sort of Holocaust survivors pass away, and we don't have too many left, to talk about how not only the incident itself, but the aftermath and how that affected and how they would live.
I think actually that was one of the reasons I wrote it now. Holocaust survivors are passing away, and I didn't want to miss this moment to sort of get this out of me. I had to get this story out of me. Part observed, part imagined, but all true.
Yeah. It's interesting also that the idea of identity you brought up earlier, sort of Sephardi versus Ashkenazi, but it was interesting in sort of a trope of Jews, both in a negative and positive way, is the idea that Jews sort of can mold to a culture, or that's probably the positive way to put it. That Jews are so it's interesting as sort of your two protagonists, let's say, are from different cultures. How do you sort of see the Jewish identity as something that's malleable, but also, that is everlasting, or perhaps lasting?
I think things are very different from 61, but if you were to really ask me, I think things are very much as the same too. Okay. There is still, and has been for a long time, a kind of higher, I won't call it a caste system. A caste system is harsh, but Ashkenazi Jews held the positions in government and in the judicial system, and only in the last decade, really more, have you seen more and more and more, or maybe more than that, Sephardi versus you've seen those changes. It took a long time. And they still, the Jews have their ways. So an Ashkenazi Jew still thinks there's something wrong with a Sephardi Jew when they have rice for Passover. So there are differences. But I think also another thing happened. I think there was a greater understanding of the Holocaust on the part of all of them. And that actually brought the Ashkenazi and the Sephardi together. When they realized that they were what's left, and then moved up forward. I think that was it. That was a help.
Yeah, something that struck me also was sort of a parallel. I almost felt like there was this 1930s Europe, and then also Israel, sort of in the early days, perhaps even today, of like this inherent danger. That was sort of brought out as different people are in Israel, and the army comes up, and sort of the present danger or the fighting that's necessary to sustain the country. It was an interesting parallel I never noticed before. How do you sort of balance like the danger of 1930s Europe versus danger in general, especially present in Israel?
That was something I thought about actually. That actually sort of was drawn a little bit, just a little bit, from a story that it's a story I was told that I think is true, a family tale, largely true, that a first cousin of my father, who no one knew, who was in Poland, was feeling the 1930s coming down on them. He felt it before others, and he tried to convince his family, that would be, I guess, members of my dad's family, since he was the first cousin, to hitchhike, take trains, walk, whatever you had to do to get to Palestine. And nobody would go but him. So he went early. He went maybe 35, 19, okay. He went up north, and which was, all swamps, all mosquitoes, if up at the north of whatever. And it was where eventually he was one of the founders of a Marxist, it's a kibbutz, named in AmWriting. Okay, kibbutz is still there. It's not a Marxist kibbutz. It's a big farming thing. But the thing that was interesting in the story that I was told, and the part that I don't know if it's true, but it was that when 39 came along, just before 39, he hitchhiked back to Poland and tried one more time to convince a sister, a brother, I don't know who was alive then, to come with him back. And they wouldn't leave what they had. So and there were other stories like this, okay, of the 1930s and early Palestine, those early kibbutzim, because the early kibbutzim were filled with people who, just barely got out.
Yeah. It's interesting also that they were Marxist as sort of a...
Oh, yeah.
Do you think it's a response to fascism, or how do you sort of see it as...
Oh, yeah, definitely. It was definitely. When I first saw this kibbutz, 61, I went up there. They had a huge, fairly large portrait of Marx in the dining hall. Okay. Because it was a response to fascism, exactly. And it was true in America too. If you know your study of some American Jews, and those who became communist, and those who and what they were doing, a lot of it truly was fear of fascism. Okay. But this notion that Marxism would bring kind of equality, and people would share things, and there would be this kibbutz, actually, the Ein HaMifratz, the children slept in separate quarters, and they only saw their parents for lunch. That was it. I mean, it was really, these were people who weren't used to this, but they decided to do it. And these were people who didn't think they were going to be farmers, and they became farmers. So I tried in my book to weave in a lot of history into the main story of this Susan searching for her uncle and finding her uncle. and finding her uncle, who, as he says in the book, go away, I don't want to be found. It's really a moment of, go away, I don't want to be found. But it's only when the trial is resolved and it's, as I say, guilty, 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 and I name the languages, that her uncle is free to tell his secret and to reconcile with his family.
Yeah, it's interesting, the numbers, obviously, the title of the book is about counting numbers, and this idea of classification and sort of how we process things through naming or numbering. And once that occurs, that sort of allows the release that we're talking about. So it's just an interesting concept around, identity, but also classification and group identity.
It is. I mean, when you think about it, I mean, you could count numbers in a million. You could count the numbers of the people with the tattoos. You would count the numbers. I once wrote a story for an art exhibit, and in the art exhibit, they had 8 different signs saying how many people had died in Auschwitz. Each number was different because nobody knew really. Okay. And counting, the notion of counting, of quantifying is very important. It's actually, I told this in another little interview, but I'll tell it to you because it's true. I have no idea why, but when I was, I don't know, 10, 12, when I would walk along the pavement, I would count the cracks in this concrete. I was counting them. Somehow I had a little counting obsession, but it became very clear to me in this book that was very important part of the book. Very important part.
From a psychological perspective, when you think of OCD, the counting is a response to a trauma, right? That there's comfort in clarity or, supposed clarity. So it is an interesting sort of.
Yeah, I probably had a little OCD when I was little. I don't count them anymore, but also don't forget, in 1961, survivors in America, well, in New York, I don't want to generalize, but a lot of them, they wore long sleeves, they covered their arms. Israel was hot. They were wearing T-shirts. You couldn't hide that. Couldn't hide that. So counting there was, you could do it easily.
Yeah. It's also, I guess, that comfort that sort of allows, I don't want to call it necessarily a happy ending to the book, but a resolved ending, let's say, where it's, there is a breath at the end that allows for release. I
tried, I'm glad you said that. Thanks a lot. I didn't try for a happy ending. You can't really have a happy ending to this book when you realize why Yaakov didn't go in the first place, why he wasn't free to go with his family, why Ruth lived her life all those years, all tied in knots about love or rape or what. Okay, there was a lot of that. But I said to myself that I wanted there to be some resolution, some feeling of release, some feeling of greater freedom. And I think I did that. Certainly for the brothers, certainly for Ruth, and if you're going to think Ashkenazi and Sephardi, certainly for Ezra and Susan.
Yeah, I agree. And as we wrap up here, where can people find the book? Where can people find you if they want to?
Well, they can just, my website is roslynbernstein.com. The book is for sale on, well, many places, but Amazon would be the easiest place. It's in paperback and Kindle, and love people to buy it and read it and think about it. And I am available for talks. So if anybody writes me, it's, I guess I should give you my email, rBernst662@gmail.com. But there's a lot on the website that I think people might find very interesting, including, just for fun, I put some pictures of me and my group in Israel in 1961. And just to give you the feeling of how different it was.
Yes. Well, I just want to thank you again for joining us and joining me specifically, and hopefully things go well with the book. And
thank you so much. Your questions were great. Not good, great.
Thank you very much.